Hi, this is Jerry Allen, and I'm here from Sustainable Rogue Valley to interview Dorothy Swain about a book that she's just read that's called Poverty by America. And this was written by Matthew Desmond. And so we're going to talk about that book, and she's going to share her thoughts with us. Hello.
Hi, Jerry.
Good to see you, Dorothy. And thank you for doing this. And so the first question that I had, and some people who are also sitting listening may have questions as well. Can you give a brief overview of this book?
Yeah, that's kind of a challenge. It's really a rich, dense book with a lot of ideas in it. But it is, as the title implies, it is about poverty. It can be kind of a heavy read, but it is also a hopeful book. Some of the main themes that come through the book have to do with how much of a trap poverty is. There seems to be a misconception out in the world that if people just worked harder, they wouldn't be so poor. And he does a really nice job of delineating all the ways that there are really two worlds. There are like two banking sectors, two labor markets, two housing sectors. And there is this bifurcation in society that unless you make a conscious effort to research and understand what it means to be trapped in poverty, you probably have some misconceptions about it.
Well, that brings up a question in my mind. You hear that phrase, if they just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and it seems like that may be more of a prejudice than a real truth.
There are a number of prejudices and myths that are busted in this book, and he talks about how we get stuck into a lot of chicken and egg style thinking the wrong way around. And so, for example, if people would just get married and hold a steady job and live family values, then they wouldn't be so poor. And he shows studies that document that when people are made less poor, they are more likely to commit to stable relationships. That we have a lot of our prejudices precisely the wrong way around. Another is that poor people are poor simply because they make poor decisions, and we can't make people's decisions for them. It's a free country, right? And he has a case study of somebody named Julio who he was working several minimum wage jobs and became very active in the Fight for 15 campaign for a minimum wage of $15 an hour across all sectors. And when he got that basic minimum wage, he was able to sleep more, which helped him calm down, which helped him make better decisions, which helped him think about continuing his education. All things that he couldn't do when he was trapped in that lower minimum wage treadmill that he couldn't get off of. So we have that exactly the wrong way around too, that people are poor because they make poor decisions. No, poverty really sets people up to make poor decisions.
I've heard people say that people having just to continuously rent for their whole lives and all they have is rent receipts, they're never able to build family wealth the way people can if they own their own home. Does he talk about that as well?
He absolutely does. He spends quite a good amount of time talking about housing and slum landlords in particular, not as bad guys, but as people who are simply trying to support themselves based on some property that they have and charging what the market will bear. And so I'm going to get a little bit off your question, and you
Sure.
can get me back to it later if you
feel free.
want to. But he talks about that it's not necessarily evil people who are doing this, but there is such a thing as institutional immorality, that we are all implicated in immoral systems that perpetuate poverty. And one of the heavy challenges of this book is that he really kind of keeps our toes to the fire. He is calling each of his readers out personally to examine the ways that we as individuals contribute to the perpetuation of poverty. And as far as housing and lending opportunities, so he talks about banks versus payday loan operations. He says he's not trying to shut anyone down, that he believes the most important thing, because some people may not want to be homeowners. They may want to rent for their whole life. They may
Sure.
not want the responsibility of owning the home. He just doesn't want anybody stuck somewhere. So his big call is for a proliferation of choices for people across the board, so that we're not deciding for a person in poverty what they need. We are expanding their choices so they can decide what fits them the best.
That's great. That, I want to say something that calls to mind something that was recently said by a leader of the Housing and Urban Development Department.
Mm-hmm.
He said, in the last 50 years, we've failed the people by putting them in these public housing things where they always rent forever, and then we wonder, why did they never ever develop any generational wealth? And then he says, we failed to build a success ladder for them,
Mm-hmm.
where they could move, they could choose to move up into more generating their own family wealth rather than just renting. So it's interesting that I'm seeing other people like the housing and urban development leaders are corroborating what he's saying in the book.
And just to be in the spirit of Matthew Desmond, I would even tweak the image of a success ladder a little bit to make it a three-dimensional geodesic style dome-like success jungle gym, so that there are multiple paths up that you can take depending on who you are as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
There was something you said that I was going to follow up on, and I think I may have.
Generational wealth.
Yeah, I missed it. Just go on. With
Okay, sure. I wanted to ask, and by the way, I invite the others in our audience here to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. So, are there some other key themes that come to your mind that you'd like to highlight that he talks about in the book?
Yes, and one of those was the thing I just remembered, which was, you mentioned 50 years, and he uses that figure of 50 years to point out that our poverty levels have been in stasis for the past 50 years. So you look at Democratic administrations, you look at Republican administrations, you look at money being put into social programs, you look at money being taken away from social programs, and none of it seems to make any difference. And he is really calling out kind of why that happens. The one thing that has happened in the last 50 years that has cut child poverty in half was the COVID relief checks. And then people start complaining, nobody's going back to work. It's because you're giving them this check that they're refusing to go back to work. And he says, why do we embrace that narrative? Why do we embrace that it's because money a handout breeds laziness, is one of the myths that he's quite effective at busting. And he offers several other interpretations of the stagnant economy after COVID. People don't want to go back to work and get sick and die, was one of them. People remember what a crappy job they had in the first place. They're remembering workplace harassment and don't want to go back to that. And are we saying that we need to take away this check so that their only opportunity is to go back and work a crappy job with harassment and maybe get sick and die. But he quotes several economists who looks at the history of this myth that handouts breed laziness.
Mm-hmm.
And several economists, when confronted on this, what's the evidence for this, give quotes like, well, this is kind of an evidence-free topic, or this is so obvious that nothing more need be said. There has never been a shred of data to support that supposition. And it is bandied about by economists and public figures and average everyday people all the time.
And actually, if I might add, some social scientists are talking about that and saying that by actually helping lift children out of poverty, they're more poised to learn, they're more poised to make good choices, and a higher percentage of them choose to be entrepreneurs, start their own businesses, employ other people. So they say basically helping those children is a upstream activity that downstream leads great abundance for our country and our communities. I'm paraphrasing them.
Yes,
but
let me follow up on that too. That he would agree with you and this speaker completely, but he also goes further and says that it's not so much bringing people out of poverty, it's bringing people out of poor neighborhoods. So that even if you don't change a child's family income, but you allow them to cross that wall between a neighborhood of affluence and a neighborhood of poverty, that kids do better when they're in high opportunity neighborhoods. And this has been studied by data, and the effect is so strong that you can see a difference based on the age of the kid when their family moved into that neighborhood. And so another key point that he makes is that one of the most effective things that we can do to help to all become poverty abolitionists, that's a word he uses.
I love that.
I mean, a phrase he uses that I really like. If we want to become poverty abolitionists, one of the simplest things we can do is to advocate for getting rid of exclusionary zoning laws that allow, that prevent low-income housing from being built in certain neighborhoods, and also to advocate for mandatory inclusionary zoning ordinances.
stopping ghettoization
Yes.
in poor neighborhoods and bringing more multifaceted families into communities.
And he is very careful to say that it's not a question of gentrifying everywhere. Not every family is going to want to move out of that poor neighborhood. Poor neighborhoods are more than what we see as poor neighborhoods. They are, they have, some of them have a lot of value to the people who live there, and they want to stay there. But what he is advocating for is choice, and to have mixed income neighborhoods all across the United States. And he cites New Jersey as a specific example that has mandatory inclusionary multi-income neighborhoods, at least through part of the state. I did not look up what the exact laws are. And people's fear is always that their property values will go down, and property values in New Jersey are among the highest in the country.
I might add, since I'm a real estate broker, that's actually in the law, in the Fair Housing Act. You may not do redlining anymore. You may not discriminate against where people live. That doesn't necessarily mean it fully changes the culture.
Right.
And I think what you're talking about, we still got work to do to make sure that we're more inclusive and have diverse communities.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe redlining was specifically about race. Was it also about poverty?
It was about race primarily in beginning, and it's broadened since then.
Yeah. Anyway, so just to have mixed income neighborhoods, that is
Sure.
one of his rallying cries for sure.
You have one? Yes,
Yes.
please, Ginger, go ahead.
Going back to the issue of people returning to work and how the handouts might affect that, are there any studies looking at the extent to which people are using the handout money to further their education?
I don't have an answer to the specific question about whether people are using the COVID relief funds to further their education. What he did mention specifically in this book, two things. One was that when you give checks with no strings attached to poor people, they spend less of it on drugs and alcohol than affluent people do. They do things like, make a car payment, or make sure that their kids get new shoes. They do sensible things that you would expect people to do. And there are actual studies done in poor neighborhoods that document this. They're all short term, but they just give somebody a $500 gift card, right, in a targeted neighborhood, and then with that gift card, which can be used anywhere, it's like a Visa card or something, they can then track what they spent that money on. And so they use that as a sociological study, and the fears that people will use this for immoral or poor choices is just a fallacy. It is just a tiny sliver of the people who are given that money. And then there was a second thing. I'm losing my train of thought, which is unfortunate.
Well, I can make a comment while you think of it.
I did. And that is that he quotes a number, and I want to make sure I mention this number somewhere in this conversation, and that is $177 billion. And that is an estimate, a ballpark estimate that he came up with based on data of what it would take to eliminate poverty in America starting tomorrow. And then he says, interestingly, that nearly matches the amount, the figure that can be attached to the amount of tax evasion that's done among the wealthiest Americans. And if we want to solve poverty right now and have everybody live in a safer, more affluent, exuberant culture where we are not squashing the creativity of a sector of our population, which is both immoral and cutting off our own nose, because we may want that creativity and need that creativity someday, that if we want to do that, the way to do it is to enforce the tax laws as they exist right now.
Yesterday, I read an article by an economist who said essentially, very much like what you're saying, he said that the evidence shows that when you give unattached money, in other words, it doesn't have strings attached to it, when you give money to families across the board, they tend to do two things with it. One is pay down debt that's weighing on them, and the other is save a lot of it. And so they may not go out and buy a lot of stuff with it, but either of those other two activities have a great benefit for the families, paying down some debts that are heavy on them, or saving money to be able to be prepared for their own situation. So that's what the evidence shows, not that they're just going out and having a party and spending money willy-nilly,
Right. And I want to mention one other key point, which that he really addresses in an effective way, I think, which is the myth of scarcity. That somehow we would love to do something about all the poverty in our country, but we simply can't afford it. And he quotes Robin Wall Kimmerer, and that's one thing I just love about this book. This is a book about poverty, not about braiding sweetgrass, right? Not about indigenous wisdom, but he is finding ways to integrate that indigenous wisdom in his arguments about poverty. And anyway, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about how all flourishing is mutual, and that if we come from a place of abundance, where wealth means having enough to share. That's another line from Kimmerer that he quotes. That this is where people's hearts are. This is where we want to be. And that myth of scarcity precludes, it's like weaponized to keep us from addressing other problems like climate change and pollution and that sort of thing. That we'd love to stop using fossil fuels, but we simply can't afford to do it. And we can't put an unfair burden on the poor, right? So like if we allowed the price of gasoline to reflect its true cost in terms of environmental degradation, that would unfairly be a burden carried by poor people. And so therefore we can't do this. And we all accept this. Oh no, we can't unfairly burden the poor, so we can't do this. Instead of asking, why do we allow poverty to continue in the first place? Because it's like a divide and conquer kind of mentality, that myth of scarcity. There's this limited amount and we've got to hoard it or else somebody is going to get it instead of us.
So to use that example you're using right there and follow on a little bit, if we chose, rather than just to hike the price of gasoline, to put a lot more effort into really effective mass transit and things that allow people to be able to get to where they need to be, to get to a job, to get to other things without puffing out quite so much of the fumes that are hurting the earth.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that would be an example of where we work on that problem that we were talking about, the oil issue and climate protection, but do it in a way that doesn't unfairly harm the poor.
Mm-hmm. Or there's no poor to even talk about because we've eliminated poverty.
Right.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
What impact will this book have on your life moving forward?
Yes. So I will say, first of all, it's already had an impact on my life. And one of the strongest impacts it's had is given me some language and some tools to talk about poverty in spaces that are not dedicated to talking about poverty. So I can bring up poverty issues at a environmental Zoom meeting that I'm at, and use some language and some ideas and some data from this book to help people see that some of the simplistic arguments that we keep making over and over again about, well, we have to check the equity box by doing this, isn't enough. And I want to mention that he gives us two tests for a new policy. And I'm reminded of the principles of sociocracy, how we're willing to try anything. Is it good enough for now? And is it safe enough to try? Those are the two sociocratic questions. His two questions for a new public policy will the policy unite struggling people? And will it reduce poverty and promote economic opportunity? But that idea about uniting struggling people brings up the point that there's like a poverty line that is 3 times the amount of money it takes to basically feed a person multiplied by the number of people in the family. And if you're below that line, you qualify for some assistance, and if you're above that line, you don't. It's a hard cutoff. And there's a lot of poverty that exists above the poverty line.
Mm-hmm.
And things like vouchers and special programs to help the poor typically help below the line, but are fundamentally divisive because they create resentment among people who make just a little bit too much to qualify for that assistance.
And they also don't apply widely enough to benefit the whole community. I guess I'm sort of
Yes.
saying
But
the same thing.
Yeah, but so back to mass transit. This is something that benefits everybody, but it doesn't really reduce poverty directly. So maybe we need to do a little more than that as well. That the question of vouchers specifically came up in a meeting I was at recently regarding pollution and fossil fuels and so on. And I was just like, no, vouchers are not enough. They are fundamentally divisive. They do not unite us, and in our struggles. And I was able to say it in a way that people heard me.
Because don't we have enough divisiveness already?
Yes.
I mean, isn't that part of what's going on with the sort of, warfare or, the loud disagreements in our country right now?
This is a book primarily about poverty, and he manages to talk about the environment in part of the book. And this is also a way that this book is changing my life. It's reminding me that I don't need to be sectored or siloed with my different issues. That one of my goals after reading this book explicitly to myself is to talk about poverty more in climate spaces and to talk about climate more in poverty spaces.
Well, I see that, we have a question over here. Oh, no, she's letting me know we're getting close to our ending point. So
Yeah.
I do want to ask, and for any of you who've tuned in midpoint, we're interviewing Dorothy Swain here with Sustainable Rogue Valley, talking about poverty by America. And so the last question that I have for you is, really, is there anything else that we haven't touched on from this book that you would like to talk about or extrapolate on?
I would like to talk about vision for the closing thought, that in one of the chapters this author challenges us to really picture what a post-poverty world might look like, to not just fight against this thing poverty that's bad, but to fight for this positive vision of something good that we can work toward. And he has a quote in there where he points out that an America without poverty will be neither a utopia nor a land of gray uniformity. So it's not going to be as good as the left wing would have you believe, and it's not going to be as horrible as the right wing would have you believe. He lived in a neighborhood around Madison, Wisconsin called Bram's Addition for a few years. And he talked about the fact that that neighborhood had problems, but they also were a mixed income neighborhood. So you could look at the problems and say, yes, these problems exist and we can address them together. We're not in a utopia here. But you also had people looking out for each other. There is a kind of solidarity and community that develops in a mixed income neighborhood that seems to have more difficulty, that just seems to develop differently than it does anywhere else. And he used a specific example, it was Wisconsin, so they get heavy snows in the winter, of how when you'd go out to shovel the snow, you did not honor your property lines. You would shovel as far down the street as you could in either direction. And people helped each other. Like people would help each other bring groceries into the house. And he lived in an apartment complex that had Black people and white people and Hispanic people and people of different religions and people of different ages and people of different incomes. And all of that diversity is needed to solve the challenges that we confront as a people. I'll give you one more quote from Alicia Garza. Let's see, she was one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was basically, we have to reach beyond the choir. If we are going to be effective in this work at all, we have to be willing to work with a wider variety of people than we are most comfortable with. And that notion of working with people I'm not totally comfortable with is something that, because of this book, I'm going to be looking for specific opportunities to do that.
That really causes me to think that this kind of attitude that you're talking about, an inclusive kind of constructive attitude, would probably be really helpful on dealing with some of our biggest problems, like the lack of housing and the lack of jobs, where a lot of people we don't have to just hand money to people, we can employ people to do the kind of community building work that really needs to be done. It seems like what he's talking about here is tailor-made for how to do that.
He talks about tearing down the walls between economically segregated neighborhoods rather than just throwing a little packet of money over the wall from time to time. And that image really stuck with me. Let's tear down walls.
Well, that's really great. And so I want to thank you, Dorothy, for giving this interview. And I want to invite any of you who have seen this to get in touch with us at Sustainable Rogue Valley, or to tell your friends about it. You can describe what you just heard and spread this kind of thought. You can certainly get this book, and that is, I'm going to show you again, Poverty by America, and it is written by Matthew Desmond, and so it's available in bookstores now, and look for it.
This book made me hopeful.
That's great. For Jerry Allen, the Sustainable Rogue Valley, thank you.